You listen to that, boy. All right, guys, thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great opportunity. Like somebody's on business. Come on, James. You have one job.
Of course.
All right, so it's a great opportunity. I wanted to just be here to welcome you all. We have a special guest here, Rachel Ferguson, who actually wrote the book we're going to talk about tonight. I was part of the book club. It's definitely a great read. So if anyone wants to borrow my book, definitely let me know. But this book was a great opportunity for us to look at a lot of the current issues we're facing as a society. It does a good job giving us the historical context of why we're going through a lot of things that we're going through. It gives us some great ideas on how we view as the next generation can be a part of that change that we want to see. And so we're definitely fortunate. So I'll ask you guys, be engaged, be attentive, ask questions, because you definitely will have some good answers. So the paper, I think the sheets gives a little background on her and the book. And so, like I said, we're thankful to have her here at OU. This is a great opportunity for us to continue to celebrate Black History Month. You got a DJ somewhere? But yeah, so at this time I'll introduce Dr. Russell Polo, who will go ahead and introduce.
You are going to do a talk. So we have a special speaker. I know Rachel personally from going to conferences and listening to her, so she's just a dynamic person, friendly and fun, and so I knew she was a great person to bring to campus, especially with this book. You will be shocked by the depth of knowledge she has on this topic each time. I've heard her now about 3 times in various ways talking about it, and I seem to learn something new each time. So yeah, this is a production of the Gwartney Institute, and the Menard family is a large sponsor of ours for this event to bring people together. And we are thankful for them and our other donors to the Institute to help facilitate all these various activities that we do with students throughout the year. So, all right, without further ado, I guess let me just lay a couple things out to you. We're going to have Rachel talk about 45 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And so it was a really great session we had with the podcast that we just did here at 4 o'clock. That'll come out in a couple weeks. And so she's really good. We have student members of the book club, which, by the way, Rachel wants to talk her photo with the book club people. So afterwards,
please stay.
Yeah, she wants to get a photo, and we want that too. So that actually worked out good. So book club people especially stay after for a photo. But we'll just go about 45 minutes with Rachel talking about the topics, and then we can open Q&A and go from there. So, all right, so Rachel Ferguson is the director of the Free Enterprise Center at Concordia University in Chicago, assistant dean of the College of Business, and professor of business ethics. She's an affiliate scholar with the Acton Institute and co-author of the book here tonight, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. So her commentary has been all over the place, featured in Christian Post, Acton Power Blog, Discourse Magazine, the National Review, Law and Liberty, Econ Live, and Online Library of Liberty. So she's been getting a lot of exposure through this, and it's because of the insights that are in there that are really a unique contribution. She got her PhD in philosophy, so she's got a lot of econ knowledge that comes through in the book, which I love, but she's actually a trained philosopher. So she went to St. Louis for that. And so without further ado, Rachel, come on up.
You guys are such a great crowd. You should stop me from my business. Okay. Ready? All right, everybody say hi. That's awesome. I'm so glad you're all here. So, you guys are young, so I'm not sure. I actually would just get like a sense from the audience. Do you think of American society right now as being especially polarized or like a lot of civic tension? Or has it just always been that way for you? Does it feel like it's getting worse in certain ways? I'm seeing some nods yes over here. I thought maybe it's been going on long enough that you were teens, when it started, and so it might seem more normal to you. But I will tell you that for me, you think yay or nay?
I'm thinking it's more like I'm more aware of it.
More aware of it, okay. For me, having grown up in the 90s, it feels a lot worse. I'll say that. There was a lot more sort of porousness between the two parties in the 90s. You could hold different sorts of views and be in one or the other party. There were a lot more sort of things we did together. And also, and it could be because of the rise of social media, that's something that's often suggested. It could be that like sort of the most extreme and angry voices are the loudest, right? It's the most clickbaity. And so you're gonna say the most outrageous thing because that's gonna get people to click, right? And so it might even be exaggerated. It might be more polarized on social media than it really is in our lives, right? Or than it really is in our country. So those are interesting questions to contemplate. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is because one of the areas in which we are the most polarized is our discussions about race. And that's certainly true, right? I won't even get into what's going on in Florida, right? There's all kinds of controversial things happening in the news around our conversation about race. And I live in St. Louis, Missouri, which is, my house is 10 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri, and my former institution, Lindenwood University, was 10 minutes on the other side. So I passed Ferguson, Missouri every day, which is where there was a major unrest after the killing of Michael Brown in 2015, and that caused a lot of sort of the reckoning that we're seeing today. And so one of the reasons that my co-author and I wanted to write this book is because we felt that we had a perspective that doesn't always, it sort of isn't well known, but we think it's possibly like a viable third way. It's a way to think about a really painful topic in a way that will sort of, we want to say, bust up your tribes, right? So if I feel like I'm part of one tribe or part of the other tribe, maybe our perspective isn't either, right? It's something different from what you've heard before. So that's the goal. And I'll tell you what that perspective is. We are classical liberals. Now, let me be very clear. The word liberal in the United States is used in a very odd way. It's used in a way that it's not used everywhere else in the world, right? So when we say liberal in politics, in the United States, we mean something like center left, right? Like, am I correct? Right, it's confusing. We mean something like slightly left-leaning politically. So you say that person's a liberal, that person's a conservative. Do you guys recognize that kind of language?
Yes.
Right. But when you talk to our international students, they're very confused by this because liberal comes from the root Latin word liber, which means free. Right? So liberalism is just supposed to be a system of government that's built around individual freedom. And the idea is that as societies got bigger and more pluralistic, we had different religions, we had different ideas of good life, and we had to live together, it was really important that our government just focused on protecting our rights. So our government protects our rights, but it doesn't show us how to live because we actually don't agree on how to live. Right? We all have different views on that. And so within our own communities, we can pursue the good life, and the state simply protects our rights and liberties. And in fact, those sets of rights and liberties are fairly narrow. The things that would justify the government intervening in your life should be fairly narrow. Right? So what should it be? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? From our Declaration of Independence. That phrase was stolen from a philosopher named John Locke, who said life, liberty, and estates, meaning property. Okay, so my most fundamental liberty, my most fundamental private property is myself. Right? It's myself, it's my body, my labor, and then my ability to make exchanges with whoever I feel like making exchanges. Okay? And so governments can protect me in that and make sure that we have a good court of law and policing in order to protect those very fundamental things. And governments may have a few other tasks, but not much more than that. Now, in our race conversation, we often assume that that kind of limited government perspective, sort of the perspective of the founders, can't be pro-Black. This is often assumed, that if you want to be pro-Black in the American tradition, you have to be big government. And you can see why people would think that, because there were times when people's prejudice had to be, in a sense, put down by the government. Okay, and that's certainly what we saw in say, the integration schools, or something like that. All right, but being a classical liberal myself, which means I'm very pro-free market and I'm very pro-limited government, I knew that there is actually a very strong legacy of pro-Black, limited government, free market people. One of the best examples, actually, is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a loud and proud classical liberal. He critiqued socialism. He thought it was very important to be able to make a deal and keep one's wages. He had a very powerful experience once when he was enslaved. If you haven't read, by the way, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, please dash out and read it. It is so good. He is possibly the best orator in the history of the United States, certainly one of our best writers, absolutely fantastic, and also the most photographed person of the 19th century. That's just a fun fact. Frederick Douglass. But he had a really interesting experience when he was young, which was he was still enslaved. He was allowed to go, I don't know what you would call it, rent yourself out or something. He was allowed to go work for someone else, make a contract, make a deal, get paid. And then he felt the pain of having to take that money and put it into the hands of his slaveholder. And he was only allowed to keep a little pittance of it. And he said nothing made him burn more to be free than that. Because he thought, I did the work, I made the contract, I made the deal, and I got paid. And then I handed it to this random guy who has nothing to do with it, right? So for Frederick Douglass, being able to be paid wages is actually an extremely important part of being free, being a free person. That's not slavery. And he was actually very offended when some of the socialists of his era would use the term wage slavery. He goes, excuse me, I've actually experienced real slavery. No. If you are paid a wage, you can get up and leave and go be paid a wage by someone else or start a business yourself. I couldn't, right? Or when I did, I had to run away and be afraid for my life. So Frederick Douglass is an excellent example of the classical liberal tradition in America. And he also teaches us some great economic lessons. At the time that Frederick Douglass was living, the union movement was fairly socialist. And so that was just kind of their perspective at the time. So in classical liberalism, there's nothing wrong with unions. You can form a union. But it just so happened that that was kind of the ideology that a lot of unions held. And he said the problem with the unions is they're making a mistake. And this is a great line from Frederick Douglass. He said, it's not villainy, it's mere stupidity. And the stupidity of their thinking is that they think that every crumb that's put into their own mouth has to be taken out of the mouth of another. Okay, what does he mean by those words? What he means is the socialists, the unionists think that we're in a zero-sum game, that the pie is fixed. There's only so much to go around. And if I want to gain more, I've got to take it from you. He goes, but that's not how markets work, right? In an actual free market, I invent something, I make something more efficient. I get something from where it's more cheap to where it's more expensive, right? I move it around. I make life easier for you. I make you a better widget. I make something more high quality. So what happens? We grow the pie, right? We grow the pie. And if I grow the pie, yes, my piece gets bigger, but your piece gets bigger too, right? So Steve Jobs got rich off of inventing the iPhone, but guess what? Now we all have iPhones. Some of us have iPhones, and we can enjoy using iPhones. And so we're both better off. Okay, and so that was Frederick Douglass's wonderful insight into what was going wrong among the socialist unionists. And of course, he was very bitter against unionists as well, because whenever a business would unionize, oftentimes they would exclude Black people. Okay, and so there's a terrible history of that all the way up into the 1960s in the United States. So he was really frustrated with that. Other really important classical liberal thinkers were very vital to the fight for Black rights in the United States, including two of the founders of the NAACP, Moorfield Story and a guy named Viller. These were small government, limited government, free market thinkers who wanted us to mind our own business and not be the world police, right? Those kinds of thinkers. And they helped to start the NAACP around 1900. And they felt that through the American Constitution, we could fight for Black rights by using the legal system. And this actually, just as an aside, this was a disagreement that Frederick Douglass had with his teacher, William Lloyd Garrison, who was also a constitutional. William Lloyd Garrison thought that since the Constitution was a compromise with slavers, we should give up on the Constitution completely. He was kind of a purist. And Frederick Douglass initially held that view. But later, he came across the idea of another classical liberal named Lysander Spooner, who said, you know what, if we treat the Constitution like a contract and we hold America to its word, we realize that the Constitution is actually, in Douglass's words, a great liberty document. The Constitution is a great liberty document, and he goes on to say, it's not the Constitution that was ever the problem. It was whether America had honor enough and courage enough to live up to its Constitution. So that's what the original NAACP was trying to do. They were trying to make America live up to its constitutional promises to every citizen. Okay? And we can go on to other really interesting figures like Rose Wilder Lane. Is anybody here a fan of Little House on the Prairie? The books, the show? It's been too long. When I was a kid, the show was a big deal. Have you guys heard of Little House on the Prairie? Okay, you at least know what I'm talking about, right? Very famous set of children's books about a pioneer family. Laura Ingalls and Pa Ingalls and Ma Ingalls, and then she married Amaza Wilder, right? So Laura Ingalls Wilder. Well, there's a wonderful woman named Rose Wilder Lane. This was Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter. Okay, Rose Wilder Lane. She's considered one of the three mothers of libertarianism. So if you know what a libertarian is, it's kind of the 20th century version of masculinity. All right, Rose Wilder Lane actually started out as a communist. Communism, people were flirting with communism in the 1930s, okay? So she started out as a communist, but she was a journalist. So she went to the USSR to do some investigatory journalism. Do you all know what the USSR is? Yes, the communists when Russia, right, was communist and ran another, well, eventually ran another 14 countries as part of a set of republics. Well, they were called republics, but they weren't really republics. Okay, so she went to the USSR, and once she actually saw communism in practice, she came back a libertarian, right? She came back someone who believed in individual rights. And she said, what hit her about being in the USSR was that there was this sense that there was enough knowledge at the top to socially engineer the whole society. And she actually had a peasant say to her, you know, a few heads doesn't make one great head, right? And it was a kind of metaphor. In other words, I know in my little village how to live my life, right? But the central planner doesn't know. He doesn't know what I'm good at. He doesn't know what I want to make. He doesn't know what my neighbors need. He doesn't know whether we should open a bakery. He doesn't know, right? And that's the central problem with central planning, is that the person at the top, the central planner, doesn't have enough information. Even if he was an angel, he wouldn't know enough about you to know what you should do with your life. And of course, it also requires tyranny, right? Because if I'm going to control the entire economy, then I have to control everything you do. I have to control where you live, what you do for work, what you make, who you trade with, everything. It's to command and control the economy. Okay, so it's a practical and moral problem with communism. Rose Wilder Lane was white, but when she came home and became a libertarian, as I said, that was kind of a new term at the time. It was the updated version of classical liberal. When she came home and became a libertarian, she started working for the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier was the biggest African-American newspaper in the United States. It was run by an anti-communist, a black anti-communist named George Schuyler. And she said she had found her people at this newspaper. People who didn't want to be world police, who wanted us to mind our own business, and who also wanted individuals to be free. And she started making arguments for black freedom based on individual freedom. She started pointing out to her white neighbors that black lynching wasn't just a one-off thing that happened every once in a while. It was a kind of reign of domestic terror against Southern blacks. And she said, you know, a lot of my white neighbors don't even know this. They don't even realize what's going on. So she started publishing on this. She published on the evils of zoning, the way that people would use zoning to shut out poor people, whether black or immigrant or otherwise. And so what do? You have to be sneaky about it, because it was already shown to be unconstitutional in the 19-teens to actually make the zoning about race. You couldn't say this neighborhood is white and this neighborhood is black. So what they did is they zoned for density, right? And so if you say this neighborhood is a single family home neighborhood, and you can only build apartment buildings or multifamily homes over there, what you've done is you've relegated people who are poor. They may be up and coming people, but they're coming from a poorer background. You've relegated them to that neighborhood because they need those cheaper rents, right? They need that higher density housing. So it's a sneaky way to be racist, okay? And she knew it. And because she believed in some of the basic institutions of classical liberalism, she protested this. So what are the basic institutions of classical liberalism? Talked about private property. My property, not just in myself and in my labor, but also in things, right? I can own things, own homes or businesses. We also need to talk about freedom of contract. The ability to make deals with the people you want to make deals with. For much of American history, it wasn't legal to make business agreements between whites and blacks. It wasn't allowed. And oftentimes, it was the businesses themselves who were angry about this. So for instance, streetcar companies would try and sue against the laws that required them to have a separate streetcar for white people and a separate streetcar for black people. Why? Because guess what? That's super expensive, right? And also, you're offending a bunch of your customers. They didn't want to do this, but the municipal laws and state laws required it. So it was actually coerced by government in order to make that happen. And they lost those lawsuits and they had to undertake those heavier costs, okay? As we get into the 20th century, we talk about a lot of the book, but as we get into the 20th century, we see very clearly the role of the state in creating segregation in a way that didn't even organically exist, right? So it wasn't just that people, birds of a feather flock together, right? It wasn't just that people wanted to live among people like themselves. That's really not true. There were cases where you had already integrated communities that were then separated. So there was actually a move backwards in many cases, or it was made impossible to live together. So how was this done? First, we have, and I'm just gonna wet my nose. So I think I should nod first to what went on in the 19th century with the rise of white supremacy in the South, because you really do see something very artificial being established. In spite of the fact that you had a history of slavery in the South, white people and black people lived together and they worked together. And you can still see the consequences of that today. There's a cultural difference between North and South. I'm from St. Louis. St. Louis is the third most segregated city in the United States. The other most segregated cities are Minneapolis and Cincinnati. They're not in the South, they're in the North, right? Because Southern people, with all of their flaws, were used to living together. Okay, so to establish Jim Crow in the South, it was very artificial. It was a top-down, centrally planned effort to keep white people and black people apart. So it was very artificial in that sense. And it required a kind of reign of terror, which is what the KKK was, right? It was a way to force people into compliance. Okay, now I don't mean to underplay the role of real racism among the citizens. I'm just saying that you also had coercion helping to develop and even impose those kinds of separations. As you move into the 20th century, you see some pretty nefarious stuff. So first of all, raise your hand if you know the term eugenics. Do we know the term eugenics? Okay, about a third of you, I see your hand. So eugenics means good genes. And if you think about it, this was sort of the time of social Darwinism, right? And let me be clear, this was not Darwin's view. So Darwin thought that evolution should just take its road wherever you go. But social Darwinists thought, no, actually, we should kind of control how evolution goes. We should see if we can have an effect on the direction it takes. And so the social Darwinists thought that they were scientific racists. So they thought that you could divide human beings into 5 races, oftentimes it's 5. This is not really based on any actual science, right? It's actually just how people learned. So it was very, very primitive, rudimentary thinking, not very truly scientific thinking. But they thought you could divide people into 5 races, and then they decided who was superior and who was inferior. They would rank those races. And then the idea was that we want to encourage the propagation of the superior people and discourage the propagation of the inferior people. That's eugenics. Okay. So eugenics isn't just noticing who's mating with who and things like that. It's trying to control. And this was very, very popular. President Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist. We had Supreme Court justices that were eugenicists. We had economists, Lord John Maynard Keynes. If you know economics, he was a eugenicist. Yeah, we don't like Keynes. That's right. Eugenics was incredibly popular. It was normal. I want you guys to understand this. At the turn of the century, around 1900, eugenics was normal. It was in the academy and it was considered the highest science had ever achieved, okay? It wasn't until World War II with Hitler that people suddenly decided they didn't want to be eugenicists anymore, all right? For obvious reasons. Okay, and so what happened in the meantime? In the meantime, there was really an effort to sideline Black people and immigrants. Because, and a lot of Eastern European immigrants really got a ton of racism at this time. And so that way we could raise up the white male head of household and make sure that he was doing well and propagating after his kind. And these other groups would be disemployed. They would be shut out of social life and economic life. And then that way we could sterilize them and institutionalize them and eventually have them fade out. And that may sound insane. It certainly sounds insane to me, but they did not hide this. This isn't a conspiracy theory. I have the quotes in my book. This is just what they thought. They were quite open about it, even putting it in popular freshman economics textbooks. Okay, and they would say, you know, it's too bad that we're not scientifically sophisticated enough to just chloroform undesirables. They just said that in a textbook. And then they went on to say, but since we can't do that, let's put economic and social pressure on these groups in order to exclude them. And guess what they used to do it? This is going to shock some of you because we generally think of the words I'm about to say as a good thing, not a bad thing. They used the minimum wage. Isn't that weird? They used the minimum wage. Why? Because they knew that immigrants and Black people would make a slightly lower wage than white people. That could be because other employees didn't like you. That could be because you don't know the language, right? Just because of prejudice. Maybe you're new to the country, so you don't have that skill set. Blacks coming up from the South were agricultural, so they didn't necessarily have industrial skill sets. There could be all sorts of reasons that you make a little less money. So what's the point? The point is, if I can raise the wage legally high enough that it's not legal for you to pay them the amount you would normally agree to with them, then you won't employ them. You'll only employ white male heads of households. And they wanted to exclude women too, right? Keep them at home. And so that's actually the origins of the minimum wage. The minimum wage was invented in order to disemploy immigrants, Blacks, and women. All right, so that was the actual goal. And I hate to tell you this, but it ended up having, to some extent, that effect. So Milton Friedman, Walter Williams, many important economists show that in the wake of the minimum wage, fewer and fewer teenagers worked, which is bad because your first job is what kind of leads you into future employment. But as white teenage labor went down, Black teenage labor went down much, much faster. So Black people were unemployed as teenagers more often, which then set them up for more unemployment in the future. So it really had that terrible effect. And Milton Friedman in maybe 1971 said the minimum wage is the most anti-Negro law on the books, which is, I think, very surprising to a lot of people. If we go on from there, we can look at the way that the eugenics mindset and the central planning mindset played into our housing policy. The Federal Housing Administration put into place, and this started very early in the 20s, a practice called redlining. Has anyone heard of redlining? Okay, good. 10 of you or so have heard of redlining. The Federal Housing Administration decided that white people and Black people and other immigrant groups, depending on where you were in the country, shouldn't live in the same neighborhood. They knew best. They knew how you would do best and live most peacefully, they thought. And so they were going to keep you separate. And the way that they did this is that the federal government would allow banks, by insuring the mortgages, would allow banks to lend to white people, but in many cases, not to Black people. And so they would simply say, no, we will not insure those mortgages, which means a couple of things. Number one, it means that a lot of Black people who would have owned a home didn't. They had to rent. Okay. It also means that they paid way more for their housing because the places they were allowed to live were more limited. Right? If you're not allowed to live in the white neighborhood, then you have fewer things to choose from. And if you have fewer things to choose from, the price is higher, right? Supply is low, price goes high. Okay. And so over time, and this redlining went on for decades, you started to get whole neighborhoods that they drew a red line around. They said, we're not insuring it. Right? We're only insuring over here. And those were inevitably Black neighborhoods, but let me be very clear. This also affected many immigrants. Many immigrants. And the same is true as we talk about the next couple of things, including urban renewal and the building of our highway system. So in the late 50s and 60s, the government undertakes something it calls urban renewal. James Baldwin, the great Black writer, called it Negro removal. Because urban renewal was nothing but looking at neighborhoods that didn't look that great to you, as a middle or upper income white city planner, and deciding that the best thing to do is simply knock them down. Knock down that entire neighborhood, that high density housing, and put in low density housing. Where are those people gonna go? I don't care. Right? They didn't care. And in many cases, it was done quite purposefully to remove that neighborhood. The same is true with the highway system. So remember, guys, the federal highway system is the biggest federal expenditure ever outside the law. Millions and millions and millions of dollars being handed to municipal leaders. These municipal leaders could build a political machine with this money, right? Because you could now use the contractor for your friend, the concrete guy for your friend, right? You're making lots of friends because you're handing out jobs. Have any of you guys seen the Pixar movie Cars? You've seen Cars, right? I love Pixar. Such good storytellers, right? Remember this? Remember the scene? I always think of them. Excuse me, but I always forget the character names. I remember the actress names. So I think it's Sally is the character, but Bonnie Hunt is the actress, right? And she's with Owen Wilson's character, like Queen, right? And she says, "Look out over the land." And she goes, "You see how the state highway rolls with the land? See how it goes with the curves?" And she said, "Back when we drove on the state highway, we didn't drive to make good time. We drove to have a good time." And there were all these little rural towns that were little stops on the way, right? And they were built around being right off the highway. And then there's this picture of the federal highway system just blowing up the mountains, right? To go right through, right? And be a straight line. And then all those little rural towns die. And you see them become ghost towns. And in the movie, it's James Taylor singing in the background. It's our town, right? It's a real sad kind of thing. Because you see the cars wishing that they could be there to fill up your car or fill up your tires, but everybody's just passing them by, right? That's what happened to the rural towns off of the state highway system when the federal highway system was built. But here's what happened in the urban areas. In the urban areas, the municipal leaders thought, hey, if I'm gonna get to decide where the highway goes, I'm gonna get rid of my least favorite neighborhood. Now let's remember at this time that Black Americans had built up an incredible amount of social capital. If we go back to the rise of the Black church, meeting in secret even under enslavement in hush harbors, developing their own kind of organic version of Christianity. And the way that those churches turned around as soon as emancipation became real, and they started schools, right? And then out of that infrastructure of church and school and family, you started to see the rise of social institutions like fraternal association. A third to 50% of all Black men in America in the 20th century were in a fraternal association. Right? That means they had access to really great networks. They were networking with one another and building up their own wealth. You have people like Booker T. Washington starting the National Negro Business League. And he's determined to create a core of middle and upper income Black Americans who then go on, and it worked, it happened. They went on to be the ones to fund the NAACP, the ones to be the lawyers for the NAACP. All of that economic clout and economic power served the cause of civil rights. So by the time you get to the building of the highway system, the act is passed in the late 50s and it takes decades to build. By that time, Black Americans are actually making incredible progress. Between 1948 and 1966, Black poverty was cut in half. It went from 89% to 41%. Why? Because there had been so much effort to educate themselves and so much effort to build business and property rights that by the time the economic boom of the 50s hit, they were able to take advantage of that and ride the wave of that economic boom. And so you saw people finally making it out, building these main streets, right? With their businesses, their fraternal associations, their schools, their churches, the center of their community, only for the federal highway system to come crashing right through it and mow it down. And the same thing happened to Latino communities out west. And the same thing happened to Italian communities up in New York. Okay? Because the municipal leaders just picked their favorite, I just say their least favorite. And they rolled right through that one. And then there was a side advantage to the municipal leaders, which was that a highway is a big, huge concrete wall. So now you've built a wall between the white community and the black community, or between the white community and the Latino community. Okay, well, imagine how economically isolating that is for everyone who's left on one side of that wall, right? That's going to make it very, very hard to just have the organic kind of natural exchanges that you would have if you had a kind of walkable city, okay? And so that was very, very stultifying for the Black community. And so the reason that we emphasize these things is because we want to show that the history of Black oppression in America is not just about people being prejudiced, okay? That's part of the story. And we know that, in fact, even the prejudice of racism in the history of the United States has a lot to do with economics. Because we know that people actually developed racial theories and theories of racism so that they could justify the slavery system, okay? But in fact, we find that it requires state support. It always required state support. And that state support, whether it's at the state level, the municipal level, or the federal level, could actually increase the amount of separation and segregation between white and Black Americans. It wasn't just something that happened organically. It's really important to know that. Now, one point that I like to hit, because it's kind of a popular myth. If we go back to our history of slavery, for instance, I think we often think that because, for instance, the Northern industrialists did buy cotton from the South, we think that somehow slavery was really, really important to the economic development of the United States. Okay, and what that means, or what that indicates, is that maybe a really good way to get wealthy is to exploit people and oppress them. And I am here to tell you that exploiting people and oppressing them is a terrible, and it's a terrible way to get wealthy, because actually, you know how people get rich? By being set free to be creative and productive, to go where they need to go to make the deals they want to make, right? And to invent new things and make things better such that they can then sell those things and make a profit. That's how you do it. That's how people get rich. Did you all know that everyone in this room is rich? Some of you are going, no. I understand. Relatively speaking, you may not feel that you are rich. But do you know that if you make something around $35,000 as an adult, $35,000 per year, you're in the global 1%. It's true. Right? We are rich. Louis XIV, sitting in Versailles, couldn't make the wine from not to freeze at his dining room table. You know why? Because he didn't have HVAC. That's why. Right? He couldn't do anything about it. Calvin Coolidge, the president of the United States, had his son die of an infection he got from a cut on his toe that he got from playing tennis. You know why? Because we hadn't invented antibiotics, right? So if you've got HVAC and you've got antibiotics, you're rich, relatively speaking. Okay, relatively speaking, you're rich. And so how did we get so rich? We've gotten so incredibly rich since 1800. All over the world, people are getting rich. Look at, you guys may not recall, but it was so many generations ago that people were making rice in South Korea. And now it's, I drive a Hyundai, right? They run Kia and Hyundai, and Seoul is supposed to be the most beautiful city in the world. How are people getting so rich? They're being set free. And what does it mean to be set free? It means you can own things. And nobody can stop you. It means you can take those things that you own and you can make things out of them and you can sell those things, right? And you can trade across borders, free trade, okay? And slowly but surely, the whole world is becoming rich. Did you all even know? I don't know if you know this. Let's do a little test. Is global poverty getting better or getting worse? Are we getting poorer or richer?
Worse.
Lots of worse. I hear lots of poorer. Okay, 40 years ago, abject poverty, which is measured at about $3 a day, living on $3 a day. Abject poverty was at 40% of the world population. You know what it is today? 8. It's 8% of the world's population. We have never, ever been this free from poverty as we are right now. Now, do we have a long way to go? Yes, of course we do. And abject poverty, you can still be very poor, right, without being in abject poverty. But the point is that things are actually getting better. They won't tell you that on the news, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? On the news, they want you to be scared and angry. So they're not going to tell you, guess what? Another 135,000 people came out of poverty today. But that's what happens every single day. Every single day. It's a miracle. And the miracle is freedom. That's the miracle. And so if you go back to slavery, it cannot be the case that we built the wealth of the United States on exploiting and harming and oppressing other people. So what happened? Here's what happened. Planters got rich. Southern planters got rich. The enslavers got rich. Did poor whites who didn't own slaves get rich? Nope. They were way poorer than poor people in the North, and they were way poorer than in terms of the percentage of the population. Some planters were just a few families. I mean, really. So think of the way you think of being a pirate. And it's a weird example, right? But think about being a pirate. A pirate can make himself rich just by moving money around. He just takes your money and transfers it to himself. So a planter can make himself rich by taking the labor and effort and life of the enslaved and transferring all that wealth to himself. So he's gotten rich, but the Southern economy wasn't nearly as rich as it was. If Black people had been freed to be creative, to be inventive, to move to where their labor was most needed, to improve their human capital, to be educated, isn't that how we get rich? By improving human capital and making it possible for people to be more and more and more productive? Yeah. That's how you get rich. So did some people in the South get rich? Yes. But was that the best way to build wealth? Absolutely not. And you can actually see that because immediately after emancipation, everybody realized they had a lot to catch up on in terms of industrialization. They didn't even have decent roads. Okay, why? Because they were depending on this old system of human labor. They were even in some cases handing pails of water down a line of enslaved people 100 years after the invention of the steam engine. What's more efficient? The steam engine, right? All of those people could have been released to do other kinds of work, but they couldn't be because they were owned, quote unquote. Okay, and so in fact, yes, the South was a big economy and some people got rich, but no, that is not a good way to make a whole economy rich. One really important thing to understand about economics is that the amazing change that occurred right around 1800, a little before 1800, we started to see this huge shift. And Adam Smith, the great father of economics, saw it. And he wrote a book, which was an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He didn't ask about the nature and causes of the poverty of nations because everybody had always been poor. That's the human condition, poverty, scraping your living out of the ground from morning till night and dying young, right? That's how human life goes. But how is it that some people are getting rich? That's what needs to be explained, right? And that's where he started to notice that wherever you could trade across borders and you could specialize and you could have a division of labor, right? You could begin to make the pie bigger for everybody. And the important thing to Adam Smith and to all of those thinkers that are associated with him, including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, right, and Billard and Moorfield Story, the important thing to them wasn't that there were a few people who could buy a yacht. It was that regular people were better off. Regular people. You could have a second shirt, not just one shirt, right? You could have decent nutrition. You could have enough medicine that your kids live past 5 years old. Okay, and what did we see? A huge boom that occurred, right? After the Industrial Revolution, you see population growing because people are actually making it. They're making it past adolescence, they're having adolescence, and they're having kids. All right, so there's a very popular idea about slavery. It's actually in the 1619 Project. You've been keeping up with the New York Times 1619 Project. It just came out as a series of videos on Hulu. And one of the fundamental ideas here is that we made ourselves wealthy by enslaving people. And I'm telling you today why that's wrong. So as you're watching the Hulu series, just keep in mind, that is incorrect. That's not in fact what happened. As a matter of fact, you can go anywhere all over the world, and there's economists who have done this, and look at places that have used slavery, particularly if they've had a slave harbor. They are all far worse off than places that didn't. And you can especially see that in Northern Africa, because Eastern Africa, many slaves were removed by the Arabs, and Western Africa by the transatlantic slave trade. And it's taken us all these hundreds of years to finally recover, and just now we're seeing Africa really begin to move economically and do a lot better. So those are some of the myths we discussed in the book, and let me know how I'm doing on time.
We can start in a few minutes or whatever.
Yeah, so let me just say that we do bring it up to modern day history as we think about all of those wonderful classical liberal people carrying on the legacy of being both pro-Black and limited government. I can also say that that was true when it came to the drug war and mass incarceration. So those are really very contemporary issues in which libertarians, or you might call them classical liberals, were really out front. They were the first ones to really be concerned about how the drug war would affect our rights, for instance, our Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure, arbitrary search and seizure, and to be worried about our levels of incarceration. When I say mass incarceration crisis, is that a familiar term to you guys? Some of you, yes, some of you don't. Okay, believe it or not, the United States outstrips everyone on record, all the other places, for the percentage of our people that we have in prison, which is an awfully terrible thing to say about the land of the so-called free, right? And a really concerning thing about this is that some things have changed in the way that we bring criminals to justice that has made it possible that many of the people in prison either aren't supposed to be there, are there for longer than they need to be, etc. It has to do with plea bargaining. I can get into all that in questions if you want to, but we don't go to trial, and when we do, it's not speedy. If you know the 8th Amendment from the Bill of Rights, you know we're supposed to have a speedy trial. We don't. Okay, so there are problems with our criminal justice system. There are problems with the way that we release drugs in particular. So we discuss some of those things in the book. But here's something really important to take into account. When we begin to discuss those things, you might think, okay, well, this is a book on Black history in particular. But we kind of stop and we take a moment and we say, Black Americans may be disparately affected by these things. And so we're going to hear about these things from Black Americans, but they are not Black problems, they're American problems. There are more white people in prison than Black people, okay? And so there are plenty of things for all Americans to be concerned about when it comes to a state that is too intrusive into your rights and isn't actually honoring the Bill of Rights, isn't honoring what the Constitution requires for us to be flourishing. And in the case of criminal justice reform, I really do truly think it's possible to reform the criminal justice system in such a way that we are not any less safe. Okay, so we can be smarter on crime rather than tougher on crime. There's creative uses of parole and other things like that. And so we can balance those things and bring down the number of people who are in our incarceration system. And then in other parts of the book, we talk about other kinds of solutions as well, which I'd be happy to discuss with you in the Q&A. But we are forward-looking. We look at economic freedom, criminal justice reform, educational freedom, and then also some cultural things like neighborhood stabilization, which is a form of non-toxic philanthropy or charity, and transitional justice, which is a way of really just doing justice to our past. and our institutional memory. So I'm happy to expand on any of those solutions, but I think ultimately the note that I want to end on is that on one end of the spectrum, we seem to be given a vision of America in which our racist history is so fraught that we can't in fact have a successful American project, and we need to give up on the Constitution. And then on the other end, we may have a kind of perspective that says, I don't want to talk about the past, everything is fine, let's just move on. And actually America, you know, kind of whitewash some of those ugly aspects of American history. And what my co-author and I want to do is say, those ugly pieces of American history were a departure from our classical liberal values. We don't need to give up on the American founding. We need to bring it back to its roots. We need to bring it back to its truth. And you don't have to give up on the American project to tell the truth about our history. We can have both at the same time. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, we only have one microphone. I'm gonna try maybe a couple things, have you guys speak, and maybe we can reiterate the question. But I'm gonna try to be a mic runner. So question, who wants to start us off with a question? All right, go ahead.
So you talked a little bit about like the justice system and how just ridiculous the stats are.
Yeah.
When you look at like the amount of bad people being in prison, or young people and stuff.
Mhm.
It really seems like at every level, there's a problem. Like at the top level, black people are a lot more likely to be like beat up and stuff. At the court level, a white person commits the same crimes as a black person. A black person is more likely to get harsher sentences and stuff. And then like in prison already, like it's just like it doesn't match up when you look at like population stuff. But then you look at like a lot of industries and stuff, and they seem to be moving forward. They're not perfect, but like you go to the Spotify top 10, you have a lot of like black artists who are doing great. Have black people doing great in sports, black people doing great in like Hollywood and stuff. Like everywhere you look, a bunch of like it's not perfect yet, but there's movement being made.
Yeah.
But the whole judgment like system seems to be not only behind, but sometimes it's moving backwards. So like why is it like specifically the judgment system that seems to be doing so bad?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think one really important point to make, and I do always try to make it, is that, okay, the black poverty rate in America is 20% of the black population. The white poverty rate is 10%. What that means is that that's disproportionate for the black population. Numerically, there are more poor white people than black people because there's 6 times as many white people in the United States. But let me say, if 20% of the people, of black people, are below the poverty rate, 80% are above it. And in fact, a majority of black Americans are middle class. Okay, so you're absolutely right. Black Americans are doing well in many ways. Income's going up, parity with whites, living in the suburbs, right? Having a middle class experience, but in some cases a very, very upper class experience, right? Okay, and so that's absolutely true. So I think it is important to note that when we're looking at the issues of the criminal justice system, it's really hard to disentangle class and race, right? And so if you have people who are overrepresented under the poverty line, you're also going to have people overrepresented in high crime areas. Now, many of those people are not the perpetrators, they're the victims, right? They're the victims of crime, not the perpetrators of crime. So oftentimes we're talking about, you know, a minority of black Americans. And yet it's true that even when you adjust for class, so when you adjust for things like income, you still find a disparity in treatment by the police, for instance, or by the courts. Okay, even if you adjust for behavior, like the way someone acted towards the cop, right? Or the way they behaved in court. And so, so I think that both of those things are true, and that I guess the takeaway that I make in the book is that we want to really get to the root of the problem and not just put a Band-Aid on the problem. So I'm gonna be controversial here, if I haven't already been very controversial. I'm gonna be very controversial and say, I think telling police officers or court officers or prosecutors or whatever that they need to go through diversity, equity, and inclusion training is a Band-Aid. And I say that because diversity, equity, and inclusion training actually doesn't have a very good record in terms of effectiveness. And this is really solid research. It's been going on ever since we've been doing this kind of training. There's not actually a good record of success for DEI trainings to achieve what they're supposed to achieve. Sometimes they might even make things worse in a certain sense. And so what do you want to do? You want to go back and look at what in fact is causing people to be overrepresented below the poverty line and people to be overrepresented, in terms of criminal offenses. Okay, and so that's where I would really want to talk about some of my solutions. I don't know that I can solve, the prejudice of a particular officer, right? Necessarily. But what I can do is I can invest in a neighborhood. I think a lot of times when we do charity, when we do philanthropy, we do what I might call toxic charity. We're kind of lazy about it. We do a coat drive or a canned food drive. So you've done those things, I understand. Right? But we're not necessarily thinking about how to help people thrive or transform out of this situation, out of poverty. We want to help people survive until next week, right? Or until next month. And I think both our government systems are set up that way and our private philanthropy also operates that way. And so it's extremely damaging. It can even be a trap. My friend Lucas, who runs Love Baloo in St. Louis, that I'm on the board of, it's a neighborhood stabilization organization. He's totally dedicated to just a few blocks. He's been there for 12 years and has totally transformed that block. The lives of those students that grew up on that block will be completely different from their older brothers and older cousins. And he says, you know what we do? We make it a full-time job to be because you go from office to office or from food pantry to food pantry, and you know where you need to be at what time on what day of the week so that you can survive till next week. And then you have no bandwidth left to actually do something that would allow you to build a new skill or get a better job or anything like that, right? And don't get me started on what we call the benefits cliffs, right? Or the incentive desert of our welfare system. Because in our welfare system, you're actively punished for doing better in your job. If you do better in your job and you get a raise, right? You get a promotion or you get a raise, you can lose so many benefits in comparison to that raise you got that it makes it economically irrational to do better, right? And so now I've trapped you where you're going to sabotage that job and remain at a low level because you don't know how to get from here to there in terms of benefits, right? And so we've set up our benefits in such a way, economists call this perverse incentives. We've set up our benefits in such a way that you can't wean off of that. Okay, it's really, really damaging. And so we can look at things like that. We can look at encouraging people to shore up their family structure, right? Family structure is a huge part of whether or not you're middle class or you're impoverished. It's a huge part. The biggest correlation with poverty is single motherhood. And which makes perfect sense because it's really, really hard to raise a kid all by yourself or several kids, right? Of course it is. You only have one income. You've got to go to work. You've got to pay for daycare. Of course it's going to be so hard. And it's going to be hard to invest everything you need to invest in that child because you're stretched so thin. And so then that child is more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system and so on and so forth. And you see the cycle go, right? And so I think we need to not be embarrassed about that or to tiptoe around that. I think we need to be telling young people, hey, there's something called the success sequence. If you will graduate from high school, if you will then get married, and if you will then have your kids, it is almost impossible that you will end up in poverty. It's almost impossible. Now, that by itself won't solve the problem because you don't just need to know that, you need to have examples of that, right? But how do you have examples of that? When people come around you and surround you and make themselves an example in your life. And so that's what Lucas does in Love Baloo. There's many other examples of this all over the country. I highly recommend the book Toxic Charity by Bob Lupton or the book When Helping Hurts by Brian Fickers. And these are all books that are arguing that there's a certain way that we can surround our neediest and most destabilized neighbors so that we can help them transform their lives and achieve their own vision for their lives, rather than simply helping them survive till next week and be trapped in that system of poverty. I don't think we can talk about the criminal justice system without talking about the inputs into the criminal justice system, right? Now, there's lots of other things, as I suggest in the book, to do about the system itself. But I also want to get really to the root of the problem.
All right, Louis, did I see it?
Alright, so I had a question for like a kid, like being like 19-year-old to like 20, everybody in the room, like, how would you suggest us going through our lives trying to figure out this political mess? Cause all I look around like on the phone or go to like speeches, like I've been to a couple of political ones, just outside of here. Like, how do I figure out what's right and what's wrong, man? I have no clue like what way to go because there's no me at all. Like I don't see anything. Like I just see far left and I see far right.
Yeah.
It's like, how is a 19-year-old kid, like, how am I supposed to get out my phone and figure that out? Like,
Right,
like,
right.
there's no path at all. It's just everybody's on their own path.
Yeah. Man, whew. You put that really well. And I thought it was particularly interesting, you said, when I look at my phone, right? Because I do wonder if that, first we got the 24-hour news cycle, where the news was always on, instead of just being on a couple times a day. And then we put that 24-hour news cycle into our back pocket. And now we're seeing it all the time. And I agree with you. I think the extreme voices are sucking all the air out of the room, right? They're taking up all of the noise in our heads. And so, you know, you might fast from social media. That might not be a bad idea. But I would say, this is going to sound like a joke, but honestly, you should read my book. Truly, because I explain classical liberalism in the book. And classical liberalism is neither right nor left. Right? If you talk about the drug war and mass incarceration, we might sound like we're on the left. If you talk about the size of government, we sound like we're on the right. Or, you know, we want to have low taxes, or we want to have, just small government in a variety of ways. And so there's some things that sound one way and some things that sound the other way, but there's a consistent principle. There's a consistent set of principles, which is really sticking to the limits of the United States Constitution. And doing that because we want individuals to be free, and not just as a matter of principle, but because we truly believe that individual freedom leads to human flourishing, right? Because you can actually let your creativity go, right? And be productive and do wonderful things for your neighbors. And so I think it really is very hard to navigate the extremes, but in order to do so, the very first thing you need are principles, right? And then we anchor ourselves down to the principles. And then we notice when that's going too far this way or that's going too far that way. And not to be funny about it, but if you want, follow me on Twitter. I'm at Liberty Ethics on Twitter. And I also am on Facebook and LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. And I actually use Twitter in a very specific way. And I want to share this with you guys because I do think social media may be a part of what's happening. What I do with Twitter is I curate my social media so that I'm following the smartest, most thoughtful people. I do have a smattering of the far left and far right, so I can kind of keep tabs on that. But mostly I follow these really, really smart people who are doing deep analysis and writing interesting articles and things like that. And that way, I'm not necessarily getting all the noise, but I'm getting real substance, right? Something you can really grab with. And so I've often suggested to my students, follow me and maybe look at some of the accounts I follow. And do it that way, and then unfollow people who just want to argue and call names and be anonymous and things like that, right? Because that is totally 100% unproductive, but that's often how the extremes work, right? And so we have to sort of say no to that. So one of my rules for social media is I never, ever, ever will call a name, ever. I don't care how stupid the thing you just said was. I will not call you stupid. I will tell you why I disagree. So we always bring it back to substance. Okay, and so I can't tell you how to vote or tell you how to think or anything like that, but I think I can introduce you to some resources that help you to get anchored down onto your principles and then be able to have more discernment as you're looking at both sides. But I agree with you that it's very, very hard, and we live in a time that's making it very hard. And it's kind of not fair that you all are having to deal with that. I'm sorry, but you have to deal with that.
All right, we have a question from Zoom that's kind of related to this, but a little bit different. So thanks for the presentation. Could the information superhighway or cyberspace be a weapon of oppression as well?
Could the information superhighway be a weapon of oppression?
I think similar to the highways.
Oh, I see, like the federal highways. My goodness, that's a very creative question. I don't know that I've ever contemplated that before. Well, I'm sure I've thought about it in certain ways. Because it's true that certain extreme views can be, like I've kind of been saying, can be, they can gain prominence through the internet. And so you can have little funky internet communities that decide to believe funky, weird things, and then may use those funky, weird things to try and pass legislation, things like that. But I will say that mostly, I'm most concerned about actual state coercion. So the reason that I was concerned about the highway system, right, is because people's property was taken, people were forced out of their house, right? People were scattered by the government. And coercion, you know, we can be mean to each other and that's bad and we shouldn't do it, right? And we can gossip and we can do terrible things. But I can't just take your house and blow it up and then put a concrete wall there. Like, I can't do that to you, but the government can. And so in that sense, I'm not as concerned. I think that social media can have nefarious effects. I think it's something that hasn't been around very long, and so we're still learning how to navigate it, how to protect ourselves from it. But I don't know that I'm concerned about that. I know some people are concerned about the government toying with what's allowed to be said, right, on certain tech, platforms. But I think we're already seeing the private market figure out ways to get around that. And we're seeing enough of a backlash of people saying, we don't want censorship. And so I'm not as concerned about that. Let's put it that way. I'm not as concerned about that as I am about nefarious government coercion. Now, let me just add this one little tidbit here, which is that, back prior to, let's say, the 1970s, racist legislation, de jure, right, legislation, was explicit. You had Jim Crow, that. And it was meant to harm you, right? It was meant to keep Black people out or to keep whichever group out. Now, we have, I think, a lot of government policy which is actually meant to help you. It just doesn't help you. It has what F.A. Hayek called unintended consequences. Like I said about the welfare state, do you think that the people putting the welfare state together are trying to trap you so that you can't get off and you can't get a better job and you can't emerge from poverty? I don't know that they're trying to do it. They're probably trying to help you. But the way that they have set up the system is having that effect. Do you see what I'm saying? So we call that an unintended consequence. And so in some cases of state systems, it can even be well-intended and still be harmful to you. Right, and so that's why I'm so worried about that central planner thinking that he or she has the right solution, because oftentimes they can even make things worse without realizing.
Okay, we just have time for one more question. Who's got one burning here? Who's ready? All right.
I think personally, going back to your presentation, what I know from back home, Black people being like poverty is higher there, has something to do with for Black people, for minorities, it's harder to get well-paid jobs. Just there's where I'm from, and well-paid jobs bosses of big businesses are usually white old males, and they hire white males as well. How do you think you can get rid of that without government intervention? Because back home there's something going on. There has to be a quota of 50% have to be female, or 25% have to be minorities. How do you think you can get rid of it without the government intervention?
And where are you from?
Germany.
Germany. Yeah, so that's a really good question. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. There were a lot of people who could have gotten higher in their jobs, gotten higher position in their jobs, who simply weren't allowed to by law, right? And so it really made sense to sort of require these jobs to be opened up to those people and to sort of force people to let them be promoted, right? Because we had just survived this time period in which they were artificially excluded, right, from being able to be promoted. I probably agree with the writer John McWhorter who thinks that that sort of intervention may be appropriate to correct a historical injustice for a period of time, but eventually it becomes inappropriate. And so that's a matter of prudence and judgment, but he thinks we're way past that point in the United States. And so it's true that good old boys networks, have their effects. That will always be true to some extent, whoever the network is, right? You do get jobs through networks. That's absolutely right. It's just that we have to find organic ways to blend our networks, right? And so we have to find ways in which we are coming into contact with one another, even though historically we've had separate societies. And so I think we're in a situation now in which there's a lot of voluntary desire to make sure, right, that we have like a diverse workplace. And so there's a lot of interest in finding qualified applicants from a wide variety of backgrounds. And I think that that will probably do it. That'll be good. I'll give you a really weird example of unintended consequences. Okay, this is John Porter. It's the point he makes. So when you look at, let's say, affirmative action, let's say we're talking about affirmative action in university admissions. What's interesting is I just told you about the history of oppression, right? We know for sure that Black people were held down in terms of their building wealth and in terms of their educational systems for a very long time, which means that some Black people will not be from a background that's as sophisticated educationally as some white people. So for instance, if you're from a poor, and it's true of some white people too, right? If you're from an area where the normal thing to do is not to take an ACT prep course, you're gonna have a different kind of preparation for college, right? Than someone who, everybody takes ACT prep courses. We all do that, and then we take the ACT 3 times, right? And that's sort of what's normal, okay? So that is definitely going to put you in a different position. Maybe you're coming from a school that didn't move at as fast of a pace or something like that. So what that means is not that you're not smart or something. It just means that when you get to college, you need to be at a university that's moving at a pace that picks up where you left off in high school, right? And so if you left off from a system that wasn't as sophisticated, then you will need a little bit of an on-ramp to college. Oh, you might say, I want to study, let's say, law at the University of Michigan or something like that. If people through affirmative action are fighting over minority candidates, right? We want all the minority candidates to our school. Then what you get is Harvard and MIT and Princeton taking Black candidates from the University of Michigan and moving them over to MIT. Well, and I really hate to say this, but here's what happened. Because, I couldn't go to MIT. There's no way. I would completely burn out at MIT, right? I'm not that smart. Do you guys know MIT? It's like the engineering. Yeah. Okay, so I couldn't move that fast. I don't have that kind of background in math. I couldn't do it. So if you move a student over who would have done great at the University of Michigan, they would have been a lawyer. Then they go over to MIT and they think, I can't keep up with this. And they end up majoring in education or sociology, nothing wrong with that, right? But they end up majoring in something where they don't make as much money and they don't have as much influence. Do you see what I'm saying? And so the weird thing is you were trying to raise up the Black community, but you ended up actually having fewer Black doctors and fewer Black lawyers because you shifted them over to a faster paced place, which just wasn't even necessary. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's an example where our best intentions can go wrong, right? And maybe in one more generation, it'll all be moot, right? But we're still experiencing the tragic consequences of our history, which means that we still have more needs for those kinds of on-ramps. I think those things, the private efforts can absolutely get us where we need to be. And it's just gonna take time. It's human nature, right? We have to start mixing our networks. And that's something we weren't used to in the past, but we're getting very used to now. And I think that that's moving along well. And so there's no need to keep interfering, especially when the interference sometimes gives you unintended consequences. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
All right, well, I think we will wrap there. So we talked